Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Brandon Ball. I'm the Hopkins Carey Business School alumnus and president of the Society of Black Alumni. I'm honored to be with you this morning as your hosts and moderators for today's lecture, Trauma, Truth, and Triumph, the story of Charleston's International African American Museum. Over the next hour, we'll explore the museum's powerful mission to humanize the brutal journey of Africans who were forcibly brought to this country and to illuminate the often overlooked narratives of African American experience. Leading us through this important conversation is Dr. Tonya Matthews, President and CEO of the International African American Museum. A thought leader in inclusive frameworks, social entrepreneurship, and education, Dr. Matthews has written articles and book chapters across these varied subjects. She is founder of the STEMista Project, a movement to engage girls in the future with STEM careers. Matthews is also a poet and is included in the 100 Best African American Poems in 2010, which is edited by Nikki Giovanni. Matthews received her PhD in biomedical engineering from Johns Hopkins University and her BSc in engineering from Duke University, alongside a certificate in African American Studies. We are thrilled to have Dr. Matthews here today, and I greatly look forward to our presentations. Before we begin this morning's discussion, I'd like to remind those of you tuning in live to submit questions using the chat feature below. We'll be monitoring the conversation and we'll do our best to respond to as many questions as we can during the Q&A towards the end of the broadcast. So without further ado, I am thrilled to turn it over to Dr. Tonya M. Matthews.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much, Brandon. And thank you for your service. As president of the JHU Society of Black Alumni, I feel like I may owe somebody some dues. So I want to say hello to all of my fellow Black alumni, but of course, my fellow alumni overall, and any staff, faculty that may be tuning in. I am very excited to be giving this presentation this morning, and so excited that folks are coming down to Charleston. I have to admit, my first experience in Charleston is actually this museum that brought me down here, and I definitely feel like I was missing out. I've had a peek at the itinerary for the trip. I might be stowing away. I might be stowing away. It's beautifully curated, and I'm excited to include the museum because I do think it does help to tie some things together. So with that, let me give you a little bit of the inside scoop, and then we will have time for Q&A. So if there's anything that piques your interest about what I've said or what I haven't said, I look forward to answering that at the end of the presentation. So let's get started. Truth and Triumph, Stories of the International African American Museum. And it's interesting because part of what you'll hear in the talk is how we think about context and how we think about the interwoven of what some might assume would be conflicting stories, conflicting emotions, but they really just represent the way that African Americans hold these stories and the way that some of our communities do too. So IAM, as we actually pronounce our abbreviation, IAAM, we pronounce it IAM, is located at Gadsden's Wharf, right? So we are right here on the water, and we'd like to talk about ourselves and our origin in terms of a layer and layer of stories. So the first layer is that this place has a story. So Gadsden's Wharf is the site of one of our nation's most prolific former transatlantic slave trading ports. Historians will estimate that upwards of 40% of all enslaved Africans that came into what is now the United States would have come right through the site where we are located. So that gives us a story just for the place, for the ground that we're on. So it's a site of pilgrimage. We talk about having the power of place. And we really lean into that because often when you have spots like this, sure, you'll get a monument or memorial or perhaps even a park, but you don't often get a museum. And that gives us the power of interpretation and storytelling. So there's even a story behind the design of our building and why we are lifted in the way that we do. And the punchline of that story is that once our architect discovered the stories that we were going to tell, and the ground that we were building on, he took on our language of thinking of this as hallowed ground and decided that therefore the museum shouldn't even touch the ground. So the museum's design is elevated on 18, 13-foot pillars. For my fellow math folk, STEM folk in the room, there's nothing to the numbers, that's purely structural. But of course, once we raised the building, it then created 60,000 square feet of outdoor space that we then had the opportunity to interpret, to reckon with, to sculpt. And so we have a garden. So the building is surrounded by the gardens, the African Ancestors Memorial Garden. And from this aerial view, you can get a sense of what our landscape architect, Walter Hood, MacArthur Award Genius winning landscape architect, came on board, and you're actually looking at three features simultaneously, right? So far left corner, there is our stele or monument garden. And then to the right of that is going to be the low country garden. And then you're looking at a serpentine path that weaves all the way through the back where we have a sweetgrass garden, and it goes on and on and on. He has this concept of creating gardens within a garden, and he's an artist. So for him, everything is a garden, including the sculptures that are in this space. So if I'm ever giving a personal tour of the museum, I always start on the outside, and I always start on technically what is the side of the building at the point you're looking at right now. Two things I always hope that folks feel and gather from their experience of visiting the museum is one, as I mentioned, we talk about this power of place. And we talk about the fact that Gadsden's Wharf was this site, this incredible site in the story of transatlantic slave trade and slavery, of which Charleston and South Carolina, if not the entire nation, played a very, very big role in. And we honor that, and we tell those stories in depth, in detail, and with truth and with empathy. But even in doing so, we acknowledge that this period, this story of slavery and enslavement, is neither the beginning nor the end of the African American journey. It's in the middle. And so this is part of what we're always trying to communicate. The timeline of the museum actually goes all the way back to 300 BCE and all the way up to 2020, 2021, because history had this magical thing and it just kept happening for us. So we had to extend our timeline even after groundbreaking. And the second thing, after understanding that we're talking about a very, very long story, is our mission is to honor the untold stories of the African American journey at one of our nation's most sacred sites. And if you ask me, as a point of personal and professional privilege, one of the most incredible things about being able to understand the African American journey is to get just a little bit of insight into how Black folks have this incredible ability to simultaneously hold the sensations of trauma and joy. It's not trauma on Tuesday and joy on Thursday. It is all wrapped in there together. It's how we hold the stories in our communities. And so it's how we try to tell the stories at the museum. So there isn't a sad part or a happy part or a heavy part or a light part. Every story we're trying to put in its full place, in its full context, and in its full set of emotions. And so this art installation, this granite wall garden that's on the north side of the building, is one of the places where I think we do that really well. And so I start my tours there. The granite wall sits across the foundations of a storage house. When we did the archaeological dig to excavate prior to building the museum, we didn't find any, say, typical archaeological artifacts, any human remains or anything like that. But we did found architectural remnants of foundations of structures that would have been there when this was an active trading port. So one of those things was a storage house. And it was another one of those moments where we had to gently remind ourselves that at this period of time in our history, we were not transporting people, we were essentially importing livestock. And so you're going to get things like storage houses. So then we've got to figure out what to do with this structure. We do some history, some research. We discover that there was an unseasonably cold winter that came into the Low Country. That's the region that we're in, late 1700s, early 1800s. And at the same time, the market was low. And because of this, upwards of 700 enslaved people were simply being held at the wharf all winter, waiting for their price to go up. And what the record would show is that over 700 individuals died simply waiting for their price to go up. And it turns out that our storage house was one of those storage houses. So now we really have to think about how we're going to tell this story, but in the way that we tell stories, in full context, with the full interweaving. And so what we did is we outlined the foundations as a one-dimensional flat brick outline on the ground, surrounded by this really kind of lush greenery and lawn. And then across the boundaries of that storage house, we have these two giant black granite walls. They're huge, they're heavy. They're actually in three pieces because we allow the foundation outline to cut through the walls. And you can actually see one of the openings there. So the outside of the wall is kept very rough. The inside of the walls were polished so smoothly, they actually act like a mirror. And so when you're walking between those two granite walls, you can see your reflection going back and forth from side to side, as you're also looking at the reflections of the carved cement statues that are in between those walls. And those statues, which are hunched and crouched inside the space, of course, represent those that we lost in that space. But if you're looking at them carefully, as the statues get closer and closer to the water, they appear to be emerging out of the concrete. And on the outside of the black granite walls, we've inscribed Maya Angelou's poem, "And Still I Rise." And there's also a speaker system that's constantly reciting that poem, as well as snippets of African voices and music in that space as well. So it's just one of the examples of how we really work to tell the full story. And so this is a picture of the museum from the back side or the front side. It depends. We're in the South. Everything is a yard. So we have an east yard and a west yard. And so this is, if you were in a boat looking at the water, this is actually the view that you would see. And you're looking at the tide tribute, which the tide tribute is obviously a tribute to those who were brought and those who were lost in that space, and is a very, very shallow infinity reflection pool. But the pool is actually powered by a pumping system so that the water raises and empties every other hour, as if this pool is always in conversation with the tide. And sometimes the idea is that this water is going down, we're remembering those who we lost. And if the waters are rising, we're remembering those who came up out of that space. Of course, everyone who steps through has their own interpretation of what they're experiencing at that space. So that is just kind of an introduction to the space and the outside, because the place has a story. The second layer is, of course, let us tell you a story. We're a museum. We love to tell stories. We're a history museum. We're going to tell you a lot of stories. And so that is what we, of course, have when folks come inside the museum. But we are a modern museum. So we've done some incredible things with light and breath and air and technology. One of the things people tend to be very surprised about when they come into the museum is how light the energy is, how open and wide the space is. One of our design elements is that when you come in the front door, you can actually see all the way through all of the planes of the mirror out to the ocean. So for example, if you're looking at this picture, you can see that as you go far, far back, there seem to be open windows. If you're actually in the museum, you'll be looking at the entrance to the Atlantic Ocean in that space and place. And as I've come through these pictures, you've gotten an idea of how we have our first gallery, which is the series of eight. We only see three in this. We have 8 12-foot screens that are flashing still and moving pictures that basically cover the entire timeline of the museum, the themes, the stories. There's music, there's a soundtrack, there's mixes of pictures from here, of course, the United States, to countries, people, and places all over the world, because it's one of our first deep dive introductions into why we are the International African American Museum. And it's because we work really intentionally to tie the African American story to the African diaspora, which is, my grandmother is from New Orleans, to those of you up north. So my grandmother's from New Orleans. And so we like to gently tell folks, we didn't make up Mardi Gras, we brought that with us. So you'll see Mardi Gras, you'll see Carnival, you'll see all those kinds of things. You'll see why there's a rice dish in every Black and brown country in the world. And so we talk about those kinds of things. Religion, spirituality, and of course, everyone's newly fascinated with dandyism. We always have a little bit of that in there as well. And so this is the first experience inside the museum. Fun behind the scenes fact: We created that because we knew our timeline was long, so many stories, and we didn't want folks to be overwhelmed with all the different things we were trying to give them. And so we said, hey, how about a fun kind of pictorial mini video kind of introduction to the space, right? And so that's why we created these different videos and ways of seeing things. So people just walk through it like moving wallpaper, right? So now they feel comfortable, they get a sense of the energy and the vibe. What we discovered is that people loved this experience, and they really appreciated the introduction. And their move was simply to stand there and watch the whole thing. It's 27 minutes long, and it's right in front of the front door. So when we first opened, we would just have, I don't know, a couple hundred people just standing there. They're gonna wait for it. Then they see their favorite picture and they're like, oh, I missed it, while they're trying to get their camera out. They'll stand there, wait for the picture to come back. So these are the kinds of things that we learn. We've learned how to move folks along, how to move them through. You're looking at the East Wing, and so sometimes we encourage folks, if there's a little backup at the East Wing, you can always start in the West Wing. And so with that, we are modern. So of course we do have digital activities, engagements, video screens, but of course we are a history museum. And so we have more than 700 objects in our current collection, which makes us very interesting because this is around the number of objects that would be displayed in, say, a large scale museum such as ourselves. The International African American Museum is the second largest encyclopedic African American history museum in the country, second only to the Smithsonian. But what is different is we're new and we're young and we're intentionally collecting. So about 95% of our collection is on display at all times, as opposed to in a lot of museums, it's the opposite. It's about 5% of the collection on display and a lot more in storage. Our collection focuses on the Low Country. That's this region of South Carolina that we talk about. West and Central Africa, as well as our neighbors over in the Caribbean, and various conversations and artifacts about the rest of the country and the rest of the world, because we are a national museum with an international lean in that space. And we've spread this across 10 galleries. The East Wing is culturally and geographically organized. And so you're going to be going through galleries such as this one. This is the Gullah Geechee Gallery. I think you guys will be spending a lot of time in this space and a lot of time in these conversations when you come on down to Charleston. I would argue that every American history museum ought to have a little bit of Gullah. But we here in South Carolina, in the heart of it all, can have an entire gallery. And so a lot of things that you see or you know or you think about when you think about Black Southern culture, such as the Praise House, such as perhaps Southern cooking, quote, such as perhaps people on waterways. A lot of that is the West African influence on the building of our nation. And a lot of that is centered because of the Gullah Geechee influence, which is the Gullah Geechee community has been able to maintain their ways and their ties and their traditions. And a lot of this had to do with geography and the particular structure of the plantation system on the coast of South Carolina, meaning it tended to be more isolated. There tended to be more prevalence of enslavers having homes elsewhere. And so part of the idea is that the enslaved community could then maintain their culture because they weren't as under a watchful eye for things like building community. And then also after the Civil War, let's just say we were slow to rebuild infrastructure in places where African Americans were then going to reside, which created another couple of generations of isolation. And so if you come into the space, you can actually still hear the accents. We're known for the food, though I will give a nod to the fact that a lot of what we consider really tasty Southern cooking is basically the West African influence on American cooking styles, because no one ever went on a foodie tour for porridge in England, okay? So if it has a little spice to it, it was probably us in that space. And so we're very much known for that. So if nothing else, the food on your visit will be amazing. So we do a deep dive into this culture and this community. Here is actually a shot of the African Roots and Routes Gallery. As I mentioned, our timeline goes all the way back to 300 BCE, and that wasn't actually arbitrary. We chose that time frame because 300 BCE is the first known record of human rice cultivation on the continent of Africa. One of the things that I found really interesting when I took over this role and began to understand the stories we were telling is that, of course, being from the Washington, D.C. area, when I was taught about slavery in America, it's usually through the lens of cotton. As I understood, cotton is the cash crop. There were more cash crops than cotton, and rice in particular was a major and a critical one. So down here in the low country, it was rice. South Carolina, particularly this region, went from dabbling in everything. We had two kinds of cotton. We had indigo. We were trying to figure out how to grow rice. We couldn't really make anything stick until we began deliberately enslaving Africans from communities that already knew rice culture, particularly those that knew rice culture at the intersection of freshwater and saltwater, right? Which is exactly what the coast of South Carolina looks like. At that point, we went from dabbling in rice culture to becoming a near global superpower in it. During our heyday, we were actually challenging China for the #1 position as global rice exporter to the world. This is how Charleston becomes the richest city in all of the colonies. This is how South Carolina becomes one of the wealthiest colony in all of the colonies. This is a big part of the foundation of American wealth. And so we talk about that, right? We talk about the genius, the innovation, the skill that was deliberately sought after and enslaved in this particular place, which is why we do this connection between the rice culture and use that as the tie through line. Something we're also known for, so bring your extra petty cash, is the sweetgrass basket. Right. Okay. So we are known for these sweetgrass baskets that are beautiful, intertwined. And so we have sweetgrass baskets from Charleston in our collection, as well as sweetgrass baskets from Burkina Faso and other places. And so we're trying to gently remind folks that a lot of these things are cultures and ways of being and art forms that were brought with the Africans and that then were been transformed to be part of our culture here. This slide is one of my favorites. It demonstrates two things about IAAM, which is one of our galleries is a special exhibition gallery. So we have our core galleries, but we also have our special exhibition gallery that we can change out every 3 to 6 months, right? Depending on what has happened. We've had more than our fair share of changing exhibits in the space since opening. And so I'm excited for what you all will see when you get here. The other point is that we made an interesting decision in building the International African American Museum. We are a history museum with a very long timeline, but we chose to go contemporary art with our art collection. All right, so for those who really like contemporary art, like to see the world in color and pictures, you're going to really enjoy your experience with us. And it's an interesting, some would say bold choice for us to go contemporary art. So one, it does two things for us. It reminds our visitors, as well as reminding us that the drum goes on, that the story goes on, that we keep our mantra, we're all in the middle, right? So when we're talking about history, we're talking about history to learn as foundation for moving forward, not as a way of looking backward and wallowing in our history, but that we need our history as the foundation for the future. And you can always see the echoes, you can always see the influences. So we go contemporary art, and the art is, as we say in the museum world, in conversation with the history and the artifacts that we're talking about. So that's the first point. The second point is the thing that I love and I envy about contemporary art is that anybody can walk up to a contemporary art piece, study it for a minute, and then exclaim, I don't get it. I do not get it. And nobody judges you. Some folks are probably agreeing with you, and it's okay for you not to get it. And heaven help if you happen to be standing next to someone who does get it, because then they will be more than happy to explain it to you in detail. And there's an energy to that, right? We are talking about challenging history. In some places, we're talking about contested history. So to create a feeling in the space where you are allowed to say, I don't get it. And there's no judgment for that. And you are welcomed and encouraged to say that. And trust, there's always a closet historian within shouting distance who probably will hear you and is more than happy to engage in conversation with you about that. So part of having a contemporary art collection also resets and levels the energy in the space to give people an understanding of what it is we truly want them to experience while they're here. This is somewhat an example of that in the way, I've been very excited and impressed by how we, and this is definitely the Royal Global we, all of our programming staff, our team, facilities, has been able to create a space that does invite community in different ways. So one of the things we see in the museum is people sort of what I call breaking the wall of museum, which is, you go into a museum, you know how this is supposed to work. If somebody's looking at what you're looking at, you just kind of step back a little bit, wait for them to finish looking at it, and then they move, and then you move. It's like an informal cue kind of thing, right? You give everybody their own space within the museum. We actually see people breaking the wall, right? We see strangers, we see groups that did not come together, people who don't know each other, sharing the experience of taking in an exhibition or a label or a piece of art. And we're really, really excited about that because one would assume that in a museum that hovers over top of a transatlantic slave port, that maybe folks would be giving each other a lot of distance, in that space. And it's not what we wanted and it's not what we see. So we're excited about that. So this is sort of one of the pictures I use to demonstrate that in somewhat. And so you're basically looking at two sets of sort of families who didn't quite come together. And you're like, yeah, there's a little distance between them. There sure is. But look at the far side of the bench. Those families could be way spread apart if they wanted to be. And we can hazard a guess that perhaps they have different backgrounds, different relationships to the story of the building of our nation. And they're actually watching the clips in the video that talk about a very challenging period for us, which is honestly, these days it could be Black Lives Matter, it could be 1960s, it could be the 1920s, and we were talking through these things. But you have these two different families watching and sharing the same experiencing, choosing to have less distance between them than they have the option to. And this is part of what we're looking for. This is what good curation, good visuals, and frankly, a good soundtrack can do for a museum experience. As I said, we use a lot of technology. This is a clip from the Carolina Connections Gallery. We are a national museum and we do actually cover national stories and really do lean into conversations around the African diaspora all over the world. But we have an entire gallery dedicated to why South Carolina, right? Why here? Why that? One, you can just do the numbers and understand that, well, yeah, if you've got such a portion of the population coming through this space, yeah, there should be a lot of roots there, a lot of history there. But South Carolina has always been in the mix. And so we tell the stories of folks like Althea Gibson, which many people have heard of, the first African American to win at Wimbledon. Nobody knows she's from the middle of nowhere, South Carolina, right? So we talk about that and we claim that. Dizzy Gillespie, sorry, Grandma, he made his name in New Orleans, but he is from South Carolina. So everything from astronauts to politicians to writers to particular moments in history. The first place that Coretta Scott King appeared publicly after the assassination of Dr. King was actually in Charleston, South Carolina, at the nurses' protest, right? So the African American nurses were protesting for better and equal treatment, which ultimately had a ricochet effect for improving the treatment and the status of nurses, regardless of background and color, throughout the sector. And so we've got moments like that. And so we're helping folks to understand how important South Carolina is. And honestly, that's not just a conversation for the rest of the country, it's a conversation for South Carolina as well. To remind ourselves how important we can be, and we continue to be to the conversation in the United States of America. Folks don't just come down to South Carolina for electoral votes. We've always been that important, and so this gallery helps to display that in that space. And the couple that you are looking at, they are exploring some of the South Carolina connections through our giant digital board. I think up to 16 folks can operate the board simultaneously. It's a place-based experience. So you choose a topic or theme: education, innovation, religion, and then it will show you points all over South Carolina where incredible moments of history were made around those topics. It is part of the South Carolina African American Commission's reinvention of the Green Book. And so we digitized that and we put it actually into the museum. For those who are like, I think I know what the Green Book is. The Green Book was a book when African Americans were traveling, particularly during the Great Migration or even just a little bit before, where it showed places where we would be welcome or safe when we are traveling, particularly in the South. So this place has a story. The museum's going to come in, let us tell you a story. And then last but certainly not least, it is come share, find, and explore your own story. One of the things that IAAM is known for is our Center for Family History, which is an active, globally connected genealogy research center that we have inside the museum. So IAM is connected to some of the largest genealogical databases in the world. The Genealogy Center is open to the public with admission to the museum every day. It is as big as our largest gallery. And folks, if you know anything about museums, you're going to ask, oh, I thought the one thing museums never had enough of was space. You gave an entire gallery level of space to a genealogy center. You're right on both counts, right? But this was really important, right? Because part of one of the interesting challenges illuminated by the story of African American history is how difficult it is to do African American genealogy, particularly because of the record keeping. And when you're considering folks or communities or experiences less human, less worthy, less important in recording, the documentation tends to get really iffy. But the interesting thing is that knowing your own history is part of what makes this bigger history, capital H, important and relevant, right? So it's really important for all of us to have access to that. And so that's why we chose to dedicate so much space to the genealogy conversation. The space is staffed with specially trained genealogists, genealogy researchers. Our volunteers have an extra long training period actually to be able to work in this space. You can see at the top right-hand corner and the lower left-hand corner examples of folks working with our live kiosks. We have some completely self-directed kiosks. You can go in there, you can start plugging in your great-grandma's name, and boom, you are off to the races. Down at the bottom, we do have our roving team members, staff members, volunteers. If you'd like to sit down, have a little bit of a deeper dive, and look into those spaces. But we also use it as a convening space, a gathering space for conversations, and we are a museum. So we did stick a little bit of exhibitry there on the walls where people are looking. But part of it is examples and inspiration. And so a couple of things here. So one, a genealogy center in a space like ours can be particularly powerful because, as I mentioned, when you're talking about certain communities' genealogy or certain periods in time for any community, and you're dealing with record keeping, there's some sensitivity involved. In a space like ours, we can acknowledge what the challenge and the bias was. And once you name the problem, you are more than halfway to solving it. For example, military records are often like the keys to the kingdom in doing genealogy for anyone, any family. If you have folks that have served in the military, there tends to be more than enough sort of data and ways of tracking in that space. In a space like ours, we can acknowledge and we can talk through periods. There were significant periods in time where African American soldiers were openly running against a wall that was trying to deny them their pensions, right, or their benefits. So many hoops you had to jump over, so much paperwork you had to fill out to prove you did what you did, you were still eligible. And while we will lament that those biases existed, to be able to acknowledge those biases is to be able to understand that therefore, since there were so many hoops and so much paperwork, African American military pension records look more like mini biographies than they do an application for pension, right? You get all the deeds. You might even figure out where the aunt lived because you had to justify that you had some other home to go to if you couldn't pay your mortgage here or there or those kinds of things. And so we can use that understanding and that understanding of that period and that space to know where we should look and to understand what we're looking at when we get there as well. And so this will be true for other sensitive documents like invoices, or we were selling people, wills when we were giving folks away. Our goal is not just to get people back to South Carolina. It's actually to get them back to South Carolina through the port at Gadsden's Wharf and back over to the continent of West Africa, Central West Africa. And we've been sometimes successful at being able to do that. A question we do get is, so it's great, it's cool, you guys just do African American genealogy. Of course not. We do everyone's genealogy because we are connected to the largest databases. And fun fact and poorly kept secret, we're probably all related. So we're going to need to be able to do everybody's genealogy in order to be able to get this done. And I think it's a good space for getting through tough periods and points anyway, because like I said, all of this is in the middle of the story, and that's a big part of what we communicate there. So I will conclude by noting we just passed our second anniversary. So we are indeed the baby of the bunch. And when I mean just passed, I mean just passed. It has not been 30 days since our anniversary yet. We opened on June 27th. 2023. So in those 2 years, we've had over 300,000 visitors to our schools and to our programs and over to our museums. So we're very, very excited with that. And if we include our online visitation, which we should, because modern world, we're almost at 400,000 visitors in terms of that. Nearly 10,000 genealogy sessions and attendees. Every time I flash this slide up, the team was like, "No, Dr. Matthews, the number's higher now." Just good news. Good news. We do live drop-in genealogy sessions that are free and included with admission every weekday at the museum, but we also do them online, right? Because actually, we broke ground in 2019. Do the math, which means that we ended up piloting a lot of our programs virtually as we were learning and practicing them. And some simply worked, right? And so we keep a lot of our genealogy sessions in particular online in terms of that. So folks can jump in there. We've got a $12.7 million annual budget. So being large means physically large also, in terms of what we do, but we're an independent 501c3 nonprofit. So how do we keep that afloat? Well, we have folks like members. We had nearly 50,000 charter members across the nation when we opened, and we've kept that going. And truthfully, that's actually the secret sauce in terms of how institutions like us stay open and make sure that we can remain accessible. One of our most significant gifts allows all school children on public school field trips to come to the museum at no admission cost. So we're very, very excited about things like that and to be able to think through that. So you do all that, you have all those visitors. What happens? Time Magazine named us one of the greatest places in the world, one of the 100 greatest places in the world in 2024, which we actually understand in this region of the country pales in comparison to the fact that Gardens and Guns did a feature on us. Listen, we know where we are. So those kinds of things are very important. And all of that, of course, led to a visit from a sitting president on his last day in office. Joe Biden came down to the museum with the First Lady, and of course, our very own Congressman Jim Clyburn was also on that journey. So we've had some amazing moments in these 2 years, and I'm excited we'll have amazing moments more, because it's a journey. And we are in the middle of the journey. We're still figuring things out. For those of you who are out there with your own businesses and entrepreneurs, you understand 2 years is nothing. We are totally a startup, right? So if you come listen to this presentation in 45 days, it might be different because I might be talking about different things as we move forward. But we're excited, and it'll definitely be worth your while when you come down to the visit. And even though it may seem like I gave all the spoilers, you'd be amazed, right? Just being able to sort of see us in person. And so, of course, this is our website for those of you who aren't already multitasking and Googling all of this on the other screen anyway. You can go ahead and do that now. And if you didn't catch my subtle hint about how we as a nonprofit survive, let your fellow alumni be more explicit. This is the QR code where you can become a member and help keep the dream alive. So with that, I will say thank you very much. And we will go into the Q&A. So we'll flip it back over to Brandon.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Matthews, for a fascinating presentation.
Of course.
I'm so excited to get the chance to dive into some Q&A portion of our program. And as always, I encourage those of you watching to continue to pose those questions to Dr. Matthews using the chat below, and we will do our best to respond to as many questions as possible. But I also want to take a moment to highlight an incredible opportunity. So from February 8th through the 13th of 2026, the JHU Lifelong Learning Team will host Hopkins Journey, and that's when we're going to Charleston to the African American experience. And this 5 day trip to all alumni is open to all alumni friends, and it explores the rich culture of the historic landmarks of Charleston. And joining us is the Peabody alumni and faculty member, Dr. Jasmine Piggott, who will offer a special focus on South's spiritual music traditions. And it's a perfect chance to experience the museum as well. So you can get to experience that firsthand. And we were also thrilled that Dr. Matthews will be with us again to address the traveling group at a local alumni dinner during this trip. So for more information, please make sure to visit the link at jhu.edu. And with that said, let's hop into the first question. So
Mhm.
it says, Sydney asks, was there any substantial pushback to the founding of the museum or the work you're doing during to tell these stories? And I'm sure most folks see the importance of this, but in this political climate, how did that go?
Oh, come on, Sydney. That was way to start with the easy question. It's interesting. The answer is a yes and you might actually even be surprised to know that in the founding of the museum was actually a 20-year journey, 20 years from first announcement and conception to actually getting the doors open. That some of the initial community pushback even came from the African American community who were not so sure that they could trust the creation of such a museum inside a space like Charleston, like South Carolina. And that's actually part of what I would say that first decade was about, right? It was about those community conversations, about making sure we had the right folks and the right stories at the table. And I can honestly say, ooh, there were some missteps there in terms of sort of thinking through that and recovering that. So that was one, right? So the good news is that there was a watchful eye in that space. And in terms of how conservative South Carolina is and also how the nation is, it's definitely, I think, a yes and. There were definitely voices that were critically opposed just for the sake of opposition, right? So you put them in that category. But then there were folks who said, well, folks don't want to just come and hear sad stories. Is this going to affect tourism? Is this going to affect the brand, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And so part of that was getting over that. And we ended up in a place where we said, well, the story simply needs to be told. So we're going to figure out how to tell it the best that we can, and we're going to accept kind of the responsibility for that. But what I would say the rest of us knew is that truth is not a budget breaker, right? It really does help. Folks really are fascinated. And what this particular climate has done, it has reduced the number of places that you can actually go and be authentically curious and ask like real questions about this conversation. Not necessarily hard questions, but you want to be like, I never heard of the Orangeburg Massacre. Could somebody please? I'm sorry. I just want to know. And so, as we've reduced the number of places where you can do that, I think that's one of the reasons why the museum has become a gem of the Low Country community and the arts and culture. And so, yeah, we definitely still get some pushback. Right now, we are in the vortex of the funding being pulled and sort of all those kinds of things that are also happening. And folks who want to support us but feel like I can't right now because that's not the kind of attention I can take. So, yes, we are definitely feeling that as well. But I would also say that we're getting a lot of thank yous. Well, in the South, so we're getting a lot of thank yous, and we're praying for yous in the space that we come. So I would say, yeah, there is definitely a headwind, but I think that the tailwind is a bit stronger for us right now.
Good deal. She also had a quick follow-up question. She says,
Mhm.
does your collection include craft-like work in addition to art? So she said the
Mm.
Walters had an amazing exhibit of quilts from the G's Bin a while back. So she had a quick follow.
So it's yes for that. We definitely have some craft works. We have actually a couple of quilts in our collection, and sweetgrass baskets, as I mentioned, is where we go for that. And I will tell you that I saw one of the first iteration of the G's Bend quilt traveling exhibitions before I was a museum person. I've always been a fan. And one of my goals is to be part of the creation of a new and bigger one and travel it all over the country. So keep sending me good vibes on that one.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so Barbara says she loves how the museum creates a space that is so full of light, open, thoughtful, and non-judgmental. She asks, how are you using the atmosphere to connect with the next generation of visitors, students, teens, and young adults?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's probably one of the parts of our business that is growing like the fastest in big iterations, right? So the first part was creating our programming. We don't use the word curriculum, our programming for students. So we have very set ways through the museum for fourth, eighth, and 11th graders. And part of that is we simply tied it to school standards. That's when they were learning about things that were in the museum. We got those funded. So that is, sort of the young generation. We just started summer camps. So we have about 4 or 5 weeks of summer camps. Each week is actually different. So again, we're still with the babies there. What we've actually also started to do is we now have interns. Sometimes the intern is coming from somewhere else. So Bank of America has an internship program for high school students. And we actually have one of those interns. And we also do, even though people use different language now, an alternative spring break around undergraduates and getting folks engaged. The last part that we do is that we're also trying to get out of the way and allow our space to be used by other organizations that are constantly stewarding these students, right? So you've got the Divine Nine, or you've got the Boys and Girls Club or the YMCA. So we try to be a host for their events if they want a cool space where they can bring folks. So we ran out of space, so we're taking over part of the building that's next to us so we can create some more space for that kind of convening. But I think for me, while I definitely want to have our own set of robust programs, there are always other groups out there that can do more because they're not running a museum. And so I think the key to that is really figuring out how to become the space and place that can be used and leveraged for those other groups. Mhm.
Excellent, excellent. So Amanda said, thank you so much for your great presentation. Congratulations on your second anniversary. She asked you, you touched on this, but I wonder if you could talk a bit more about how you thought about the soundscape of the museum. How do you incorporate music into the various areas or set the tone to an experience with sound?
That's a great question. Our interim chief curator, right, when we were founding the museum, so we brought on a gentleman to help us curate the experiences before we opened the museum. And he had a background in multimedia, right? And so he was really instrumental in that. And so when you're, for example, on the outside of the building, right? On the north side, next to the wall I was telling you about, there are speakers, and there are also speakers on the south side. And these will rotate through snippets of poems, snippets of African languages, giving greetings and saying short phrases, also snippets of music from all over the world. And one that actually creates a bit of interesting energy, sort of in that space, right? Because people come to the space trying to figure out how to honor it, right? You have a bit of the story and they're thinking, okay, so what does reverence look like, right? So there is a danger, and I'll use the word danger, that people will feel like they have to be very quiet and very still. If you want to be quiet and still, you can be quiet and still, but part of the soundscape helps folks understand that there is movement, right? Dancing is allowed, conversation is welcome. Then when you come inside, hardly it's a vibe, right? So, and it's not an unserious vibe. It is more like, the drum moves on. There is literally a bass line to the to the soundtrack of those images that I was showing. So one that's also very cultural, right? So, Black folks all around the world have been responsible for a lot of the music and some of the best tunes and the rhythms. And so the rhythms, the drum beat, the heartbeat really is actually part of the culture and part of the experience. So thinking about how we introduce that, but also how we center the feeling of the museum in that without getting in the way of the experience, right? Because, for example, sometimes folks do rent us out to have a party. Okay, I admit I don't know how much they learning sort of in those spaces. But so to your point, thinking about that very intentionally. And then on the technical side, you also deal with sound bleed, right? So the energy and the soundtrack you might want in one space is not necessarily the sound and energy you want in another space. And so there was a lot of conversation about how we would do those things by sort of creating folks. And I think we've gotten really good at the blend. The last thing that I would say about that is that music is powerful and it's a powerful connector because it really does manage our emotions. Last year, as we were coming into the election, everybody had a parade, right? Not just everybody had a parade, but we sit right there on the water, and we are a boating community, and so there was a major manga boat parade coming through. Politics aside, we understood we were about to watch two communities come together. There's the MAGA, I got a boat, and I'm going to be going down the river, and then there's the I'm coming to the International African American Museum to learn about Black history. I'm going to assume those are two very different audiences. And what was happening was a very, very big, we're talking hundreds of boat, hundreds of people, and no one had anticipated this. We literally got the note that this was happening like 48 hours before. And so we were trying to think, okay, so how do we manage this, right? How do we get these sort of two experiences to just happen simultaneously in that? And at the end of the day, the museum's strategy was Motown and free ice cream. Okay, so we put speakers, sort of out on our west yard, facing the museum. This was not a sound blast in another direction to actually encapsulate our space in the energy, right? And we could use the music to create that community. And so folks were looking at each other with sort of curiosity, maybe a little judgy on the inside, who knows? But then they could move on and they could have their experience. And then free ice cream is just reward for behaving in terms of that. So to your point, it's a really good question about asking about music and soundscapes because it really does help us manage energy and gives different kinds of spaces for different kinds of emotions.
Great, great response. So Barbara had another question. She says, can you tell us a little about your own alumni journey? What brought you to the museum? And we would like to hear a little bit more about your STEM project. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, thank you. So I know we're coming at time. So, the sort of the quick version is, because I came through the STEM side, also the PhD side, they're always telling us, they taught us how to think. Okay, great. So I know how to think. So I can think myself into and out of different things. I am a problem solver, apparently, by nature. And so I think engineering is a really good background for us problem solvers. And then you graduate and you realize the world is a wonderful plethora of problems. And running a business is no different. I think what began to happen is I actually understood that I really enjoyed my teaching responsibilities while I was a graduate student. And Johns Hopkins had a partnership, actually, it was a grant to have graduate students volunteer at the local science center. So I got actually my start in museums at the Maryland Science Center right down there on the Inner Harbor in Baltimore. I went over there to volunteer. They said, hey, how about when you graduate, we give you a job instead? Amen, hallelujah. Do you have insurance? Yes, they did. And so I actually took that role because I didn't feel like a postdoc was just for me, and I didn't quite know what else to do. And so it seemed like a way to stabilize and be in that space. But in retrospect, I was probably drawn to that space, right? That I was excited to be able to teach and share what I had learned, that opened up the door to discovering museums. And so it was a different kind of classroom, which makes sense because I wasn't trained to teach, say, necessarily in a classroom. I was trained to teach in a lab. So it probably makes sense that then I'm like, hey, museums, this seems like a giant lab plus classroom. Let's get this party started. So that's part of that and how I got into that museum space. The STEManista project is probably something that in retrospect, I realize that I have done every step that I've taken in my wake. I've worked at a couple of museums and volunteered for several groups. In my wake, there always seems to be a program for little girls. I just happened to look back one day and be like, oh, that seems to be my thing. And so, I was a product of those kinds of classes. I was a product of a program led by, I think, George Washington University to convince young ladies to consider some of these engineering, math, science-based, careers as part of their possibility. And so I've kind of passed it on and carried that through. Of course, I've expanded that. So when I'm dealing with younger audiences, it's genderless. I'm like, I don't care who you are. We all need a little bit of math in this space. But I'm still also very focused around having folks who are post-graduation in terms of helping them think about these things as tools in that space. And so I would say for those who are still, sort of finding their way or worried that you're about to change careers yet again, knock yourself out. Hopkins, I think, prepared us very, very well for that. And there was actually nothing in my formalized preparation that particularly said you're going to be running a museum. I was simply prepared to educate myself into whatever position that I actually wanted. So in retrospect, it all makes sense. At the time, I had no idea what was going to be going next, but I think I'm solidly in the space of museums now.
Excellent. Got two more questions. I'm going to try to get through these. It says,
Okay.
Katie asks, can you tell us a bit about the school trip experience for students at the museum? Also, what does engagement look like for young visitors?
That is a great question. So we've had just over 6,000 students come through now and on field trips, and that number is probably low even as I say it. So we developed the program from the bottom up. We're in South Carolina, and I was very sensitive to the environment that we were trying to build these school programs in. And so we were tiptoeing around the conversation to the point where we were ultimately pushed. I think that the broader conversations that get all the headlines and the news coverage aside, on the ground, teachers are just trying to teach, right? And so they were like, so when are you bringing in the students? Like, we are ready, like, sort of come in. And so we began to follow their lead. So we did focus group with students, with teachers, and with principals and administrators. And for all of our consternation around the politics, they said the first problem you have to solve is the red tape of the school field trip. This is very, very interesting. They were like, yeah. We'll figure out, which books are banned later. But if you can help us with this paperwork, and so that's why our strategy was then to create a curriculum aligned experience and an MOU at the district level. Right. And so, particularly for our local and regional school groups, we have district level partnerships such that it's as easy as kind of like pushing a button to go on the field trip so we could solve that issue. And fun fact, as different as the states try to say they are about their curriculum design, it's really similar, right? Fourth grade is fairly fourth grade. And so once we aligned in that way, it doesn't really matter whether or not we have an MOU. Right. I think in that space. And so, for example, those younger grades tend to be what was happening in your state. And so you're going to be bouncing around the museum, looking at very state and regional specific experiences and ideas. When you get into those later grades, you start to talk about national American history. And so you kind of bounce through the museum that way. High school tends to be global history. And so you're starting to bounce through more around our international experience. For our younger kids, we have a really cute avatar in a coloring book. I just say she's cute because she's got little Afro puffs, but whatever. And so for some, it is that specific. Obviously, our older students tend to have more critically thinking focused experiences, but we also invite educators to come in and design their own experiences. The last thing I will say about that is it's very interesting because we still get more children that are coming into the museum with their families and their church groups than we do, say, formalized school field trips. And that's just a numbers game. right? So that's just the numbers. And so what we do find is that the parents are finding it easy to curate the experience because between the technology and the music and the experience and the vibe, it is something that does captivate young people's attention. And so I do actually see kids dragging their parents, to see what it is they read or they find, or the kids tend to be a little more focused than they might be in other spaces.
Excellent. Well, that's a great answer. And unfortunately, it will have to be the last one today as we're approaching the end of our event. So just want to thank you so much, Dr. Matthews, for taking time out of your busy schedule here today to share an important work you're doing at the museum. And I also like to thank everyone who tuned in to listen to our conversation today. So for more information about Hopkins at Home, it's free public virtual content. So to learn more, go to Hopkins at Home at jhu.edu. I also want to make a plug for those that are interested. Black Alumni Weekend is coming up September 11th through the 13th in Baltimore. So go to Hopkins Alumni Events and you can see information more about that. But again, I would just want to thank everybody for your being engaged and your participation. I hope you have a wonderful day.